March 22, 1945. A forest command post near Remagen, Germany. The map room fell silent as General Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma lifted the field telephone receiver. His staff officers gathered around the acetate-covered charts showing unit dispositions along the collapsing Rhine front. He spoke for exactly 4 minutes, measured, professional, relaying the coordinates of the 11th Panzer Division's planned counterattack to retake the Ludendorff Bridge. 47 minutes later, American artillery began falling precisely on those assembly areas, obliterating fuel dumps that had been relocated just hours earlier, catching tank companies in forest clearings that Allied reconnaissance planes had never overflown. Von Thoma stared at the casualty reports with the expression of a man watching the laws of physics reverse themselves. The Americans had not intercepted a courier. They had not captured a prisoner. They had not even needed to see his tanks. Somehow, impossibly, they had listened to his voice traveling through buried cables in what should have been a secure military telephone network. And they had understood. The General Major set down his coffee cup with a hand that trembled just slightly, and in that gesture was the recognition that the Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy who could hear German thoughts spoken in German words through German wires, and turn those words into American steel falling from the sky. The German military had entered the Second World War with justified confidence in its communications security. The Enigma machine, used throughout the Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and Luftwaffe, represented the cutting edge of cryptographic technology, an electromechanical cipher device that generated billions of possible encryption combinations. Even if the Allies captured an Enigma machine intact, without knowing the daily settings, which rotors in which positions, which plug board connections, which initial configurations, decryption would require computational resources that simply did not exist. German cryptographers had performed the mathematics, had tested the system against theoretical attacks, and had concluded that Enigma was, for all practical purposes, unbreakable within any militarily useful timeframe. This confidence extended beyond machine ciphers to the entire German signals infrastructure. Landline telephone communications, routed through buried cables and military switchboards, were considered inherently secure. How could the enemy intercept a signal that never traveled through the air? The German officer corps communicated with a freedom born of this confidence, discussing strategy and tactics and unit movements over telephone and radio with only perfunctory encryption, certain that their words traveled through an impenetrable electronic fortress. They planned operations assuming their planning was invisible. They maneuvered forces assuming their movements were secret. They built an entire operational doctrine on the foundation of secure communications. What crawled ashore behind the first Marine assault waves was an answer to a question Japanese doctrine had never thought to ask. The M4 Sherman Dozer tank, officially designated the M4 Dozer tank, but known to the men who worked them simply as dozers, represented American military engineering at its most pragmatically brutal. Someone in the Corps of Engineers had looked at the intelligence reports from Tarawa and Kwajalein, had studied the casualty lists and the stalled assaults, and had concluded that the problem was not one of courage or firepower, but of geography. The solution was characteristically American in its directness. If the terrain itself was the problem, change the terrain. By late 1944, Sherman tanks were being modified with hydraulically operated bulldozer blades, massive steel assemblies capable of moving cubic yards of earth and coral, powered by the tank's own engine and protected by armor that could withstand most Japanese anti-tank weapons. These were not engineering vehicles in the traditional sense, not meant for road building or rear area construction. These were assault weapons designed to accompany infantry into the worst killing grounds and physically reshape the battlefield under fire. The first time Japanese defenders witnessed a Sherman Dozer methodically dismantling their fortifications, the reports filtering back to Imperial headquarters carried an edge of incomprehension that went beyond tactical surprise. At Peleliu, where the Umerbro ridges formed a natural fortress known to the Marines as Bloody Nose Ridge, Japanese observers watched American dozers carve roads up slopes that should have been impassable to armor. They watched entire hillsides collapse as dozers undercut their foundations, burying defensive positions that had taken weeks to construct.
They watched as the Americans approached cave warfare not with traditional methods, grenades and flamethrowers and small unit tactics, but with industrial-scale earth-moving, simply sealing cave complexes beneath hundreds of tons of debris. Colonel Nakagawa Kunio, commanding the Japanese garrison, had planned for a 3-day American assault to drag into 3 months of attritional bloodletting. The presence of dozers did not make the battle short. Peleliu still consumed over 2 months, but it transformed the mathematics. Where Japanese doctrine expected weeks of siege warfare to clear a single fortified ridge, American dozers created new approach routes in days, collapsed tunnels in hours, and turned geography from an ally into a traitor. For Japanese soldiers raised in a military culture that emphasized spiritual fortitude and acceptance of death, there was something profoundly demoralizing about watching machines casually undo months of human labor. The Japanese army had built its defensive ethos on the concept of gyokusai, to shatter like a jewel, to die gloriously in place rather than surrender. The fortifications represented not just tactical positions, but spiritual commitment. Every cubic foot of coral dug by hand, every timber carried up impossible slopes, every position a testament to discipline and endurance. When a dozer blade crashed through a bunker's firing slit and kept pushing, collapsing the entire structure in minutes, it negated not just the tactical value, but the meaning of the sacrifice invested in its construction. Survivors from bypassed positions, captured months later during mop-up operations, spoke in prisoner interrogations of watching hillsides their units had fortified simply disappear, reshaped by machines that worked with mechanical indifference to the human effort they were erasing. One captured naval infantry officer, his diary recovered on Okinawa, wrote with bitter poetry, "They do not conquer the mountain, they remove it from existence. What are we to fight when the earth itself surrenders?"
The dozer's blade became more than tactical equipment. It became a symbol of 2 incompatible philosophies of warfare, meeting in volcanic islands half a world from anywhere. Japanese military doctrine still resided conceptually in the age of Bushido, where individual will and collective spirit could overcome material disadvantage, where suffering itself held redemptive value. American doctrine had moved into an industrial philosophical framework where suffering was a problem to be engineered away, where the point was not to endure but to win efficiently, to bring overwhelming material solutions to bear on tactical problems. The Sherman dozer embodied this divide perfectly. Its crews did not need to be particularly brave or skilled. They needed to know how to operate hydraulic controls and how to angle a blade for maximum earth displacement. The machine absorbed the risk, the machine provided the solution, and the machine worked with tireless mechanical persistence that no amount of Japanese fortitude could match. By the time American forces reached Okinawa in April 1945, Japanese defensive plans had grown almost desperate in their attempts to counter dozer operations, positioning anti-tank guns specifically to target dozers, mining approaches, even attempting nighttime raids against parked engineering vehicles. But for every dozer knocked out, 3 more landed with the next supply convoy, fresh from factories in Detroit and Gary that Japan had no capacity to strike and no equivalent capacity to match. The transformation in Japanese military thinking, visible in after-action reports and captured documents from late 1944 onward, reflected not just tactical adaptation, but the slow collapse of strategic confidence. When your defensive doctrine depends on geography, and the enemy possesses machines that reshape geography at will, what remains? When your fortifications, built with sweat and blood and months of labor, can be negated by a single armored vehicle in an afternoon, what is the value of fortification? Japanese commanders began requesting impossible things in their supply requests. More anti-tank guns, more artillery, more of everything their shrinking empire could no longer provide. What they were really requesting, though they could not articulate it in official communications, was a way to fight an enemy whose approach to warfare had become almost geological in scale, who treated the Pacific Islands not as terrain to be contested, but as raw material to be processed, reshaped, dominated through sheer industrial will. June 1945. On Okinawa's southern ridges, a burned-out Sherman dozer sits abandoned where a 47mm anti-tank gun finally found its mark. But the scar it carved up the hillside remains, a 20-foot wide ramp where none existed before,
through which tanks and infantry and supply trucks now flow in endless procession. The Japanese defenders who fired that lucky shot are already dead, their cave system collapsed by another dozer working from a different approach. And on the horizon, beyond the smoke and the mud and the shattered coral, more ships arrive carrying more equipment, more solutions, more mechanical answers to questions that had once required human blood to resolve. The blade had done its work. The blade had moved the immovable. And somewhere in the remaining caves, the last defenders of a dying empire crouched in darkness and understood that they were not fighting merely a more powerful army. They were fighting a civilization that could afford to bring bulldozers to war, that valued efficiency over sacrifice, that treated even mountains as temporary obstacles. The future was not storming their positions. The future was simply pushing them aside, one blade load of earth at a time, methodical and terrible and utterly unstoppable.